Good day. This is China Sita Balba from BS Ed Sciences 3A. For today's topic, we will be discussing the aquatic ecosystems in the Philippines together with Mark Vincent Bongo. So, do you have any ideas about the aquatic ecosystem? Yeah, you're right. Aquatic ecosystem connect people, land, and wildlife through water. Wetlands, rivers, and lakes, and coastal estuaries are all aquatic ecosystem that is essential to human economies and health. At the end of the lesson, the students are able to describe the features of freshwater and saltwater ecosystems in the Philippines and describe threats to freshwater and saltwater ecosystem. What are the main kinds of organisms in aquatic life zones? Actually, there are 4 organisms in aquatic life zones, namely, first, the plankton float near the surface of the water, where there are 2 types of plankton, which is the phytoplankton and the zooplankton. Phytoplankton is a microscopic plants and zooplankton is a microscopic animals. Second is nekton. They are free swimming. For examples, fish, turtles, and whales. Third one is the benthos. They are the bottom dwellers. Example, mussels, worms, and barnacles. And lastly, the decomposers, mostly bacteria. They break down the organic compounds in the dead bodies and waste of aquatic organisms into simple nutrient compounds for use by producers. So, most aquatic life zones can be divided into 3 layers: surface, middle, and bottom. So here's the important environmental factors determining the types and numbers of organisms found in this layer. So first is the temperature, access to photosynthesis, oxygen content, and the availability of nutrients such as carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus for producers. Freshwater ecosystems in the Philippines. So what is freshwater ecosystem? It encompasses all inland bodies of flowing water such as streams, rivers, and standing water, the lakes, reservoirs, ponds, and other human-made impoundments. What is the importance of freshwater ecosystem in the Philippines? It is a crucial life support system on which the lives of all Filipinos depend. Freshwater bodies are important resource bases for the fisheries, domestic, agriculture, industrial, and tourism sectors. Without sustainable levels of use, freshwater bodies will eventually decrease in volume and size, become heavily polluted, and eventually biologically dead waters. Lakes and ponds. Lake is a body of water that is surrounded by land, and pond are shallow enough where plants could grow. So what is the difference between a lake and a pond? A lake differs from a pond not in size but in depth. In a pond, sunlight reaches all the way to the bottom, while in the lake, sunlight does not reach the bottom. Layers of the lake. Lakes normally consist of 4 distinct zones that are defined by their depth and distance from shore. The top layer is the littoral zone. It consists of the shallow sunlit water near the shore to the depth at which rotted plants stop growing and has a high biological diversity. Second one is the limnetic zone. It is an open sunlit water surface layer away from the shore that extends to the depth penetrated by sunlight. As the main photosynthetic body of the lake, it produces the food and oxygen that support most of the lake's consumers. Third one is the profundal zone. The deep open water where it is too dark for photosynthesis. So this layer, the oxygen content here is low. Fish adapted to its color and darker water are found in this zone. Lastly, the benthic zone. It is located at the bottom of the lake where bacterial leaves, no sunlight reach this layer, and dead organisms are consumed by decomposers. Nutrients affect lakes. Oligotrophic lake has a small supply of plant nutrients. These type of lakes are more often deep with steep banks. Because of its low NPP, such lake usually has a crystal clear blue or green water and small population of phytoplankton. The temperatures are cool and high oxygen concentration provide a suitable environment for fish such as trout and whitefish. This is an example of oligotrophic lake in the Philippines, the Lanao Lake, an average depth of 60.3 meters. It has been declared National Park and Reserve under the jurisdiction of the Bureau of Forest Development. The Lake Lanao and Agus River are the sources of hydroelectricity supplying 70% of Mindanao's power requirement. A lake with a large or excessive supply of nutrients needed by producers is called eutrophic lake. A high availability of nutrients, especially phosphorus and nitrogen, support high densities of phytoplankton and vascular aquatic plants. These eutrophic lakes typically shallow and have murky brown or green water with very poor visibility. The temperature is warm. This is an example of eutrophic lake in the Philippines. The Laguna de Bay, an average depth of 2.5 meters. It has multiple uses for fisheries, irrigation, and power generation and industry. There are 8 endemic fish species in the lake, but only one endemic species, the candoli, has been extensively studied. Domestic sewage and agricultural runoff made Laguna de Bay highly eutrophic and vulnerable to fish kills. Soil erosion from the watershed of the lake has resulted to rapid sedimentation. In Laguna de Bay, pollution and siltation are the two major problems adversely affecting the water quality and fisheries at present. Heavy siltation of the lake resulted in high turbidity of its water, which limits primarily productivity and consequently production. Human inputs of nutrients from atmospheres and from nearby urban and agricultural areas can accelerate the eutrophic of lake, and this is called the cultural eutrophication. Wherever there is a low area in the land, wetlands can occur. There are many different types of wetlands. However, they have one characteristic in common, and that is they are saturated with water. Wetlands, marshes. It is an area of land where water covers ground for long periods of time. So as you can see in this picture, it usually treeless and dominated by grasses and other herbaceous plants. So this is an example of marshes in the Philippines. The Agusan Marsh Wildlife Sanctuary. So Agusan Marsh consists of freshwater marshes and water courses with numerous small shallow lakes and ponds in the upper basin of the Agusan River and its tributaries. The area has been declared a reserve and crocodile sanctuary, wherein the largest crocodile are found here, named Lolo. Wetland swamps. So what is a wetland swamps? It is an area of land permanently saturated or filled with water. So as you can see in this picture, it contains woody plants, or shall we say they are water-loving trees. There are two types of swamps, namely the saltwater swamps and the freshwater swamps. So in this example, in Puerto Princesa, it is called the saltwater swamps, where they are water-loving trees. In saltwater swamps form on tropical coastline. In this formation, the swamps begin with bare flats of mud and sand that are thinly covered by seawater during high tides. In freshwater swamps, it is formed around lakes and streams. In a rain and seasonal flooding cause water levels to fluctuate. So this is an example of freshwater swamps here in the Philippines, the Candaba swamps that found in Candaba, Pampanga. Candaba Swamp is a complex of freshwater ponds and grassland in a vast floodplain. The area is flooded in the wet season, but it becomes arable in the dry season. Among the conservation measures, establishment of a wildlife sanctuary and reservoir for fisheries and irrigation. The human impact on wetlands were drained and filled for farming and residential and commercial development, and pollution. Another freshwater ecosystems in the Philippines, the reservoirs. In this picture, it is a Pantambangan reservoir. It is a man-made impoundment constructed primarily for irrigation and power generation. So in this Pantambangan reservoir, the common species are tilapias, common carp, and the white goby. Pantambangan Reservoir is located at Nueva Ecija, built in 1974, that managed by the National Irrigation Administration. Heavy erosion of the watershed has resulted in the reservoir's rapid sedimentation. Fishing rules and regulations have been formulated by NIA. Water is always on the move in the never-ending water cycle. No matter where a raindrop lands, it will eventually end up somewhere else. The same is true of ice and snow that melts. All fresh waters on Earth, whether surface water or below groundwater, is part of a watershed. So what is a watershed? A watershed is an area of land that drains into a body of water, such as a river, pond, wetland, lake, or ocean. So a watershed is also called a drainage basin. The three zones in the downhill flow of water are source zone, which containing mountain streams or headwaters. Second is the transition zones containing wider lower elevation streams. And lastly, the floodplain zone containing rivers which empty into the ocean. When water hits the ground, it either filters into the groundwater or flows downhill. Water that doesn't soak into the ground or evaporate but instead flows across the Earth's surface is called the runoff. Another type of freshwater ecosystems in the Philippines, namely the rivers and the streams. So a river can be wide and deep or shallow enough for a wade person to wade across, while the streams is a flowing body of water that is smaller than a river. Flowing waters differ greatly in speed, temperature, and clarity. So rivers that begin from snowmelt in mountains are cold, full of oxygen, and fast moving. While on the other hand, river flows down the mountains becomes wider and warmer, slower, less oxygen. So a river can be changed depending on the land and climate it is flowing through. There are organisms that living in a river. Firstly is the mosses, which they are rooted in rocks. They are called rhizoids. Second is the plankton, where they are living in the downstream in a warmer water. Third is the trout and minnows, where they are located at the headwaters where there are strong water current. And lastly, the plants that some are rooted in the river sediment. Their leaves will vary in shape depending on river's current. So what are the threats that Philippines facing today? First is the industries polluting the water, which kills organisms and make fish inedible. The runoff from land that puts pesticides in the river and sediment, particularly in agriculture. And lastly, the dams, which change the ecosystem in and around river, which can affect the flows of water. The pollution of the Pasig River in Metro Manila is a classic example of how a freshwater ecosystem has been decimated. In the first picture that shows below, it shows that domestic and industrial waste are dumped into the river. Fortunately, the administration of the authorities take action in this and bring the Pasig River into its life. In fact, the Pasig River Rehabilitation Commission was conferred the first Asia River Prize Award by the International River Foundation, which found its effort at bringing the Pasig River back to life. Another freshwater ecosystems that found in the Philippines, which is Fishponds. It is a water-holding structures with dikes made of soil or concrete for growing fish and other aquatic species. So mostly the big or the largest fish ponds that found in the Philippines are in the Central Luzon and the Ilocos regions, where Nile tilapia, common carp, shrimps, and snails are the main species of fish cultured. Rivers and lakes are the most visible form of fresh water. However, another important source of fresh water lies beneath Earth's surface. In fact, most of the precipitation that falls on land sinks out of sight into the ground. So underground water is a water that has traveled down from the soil surface and collected in the spaces between sediments and the cracks within rock. It is called the groundwater. In groundwater contaminations, there are two contaminations that put into two categories. First is the point sources, where pollutants come from a small defined area. Example for this is the leaking gas tanks and the leaking septic tanks and landfills. Another is the non-point sources, where pollutants come from a large area. Example of this is the runoff from a farmland. What are the impacts of human activities on freshwater system? First is the dams, diversions, or canals fragment almost 60% of the world's 237 large rivers, according to a 2000 study by the World Resource Institute. This alters and destroys the wildlife habitats along rivers and in coastal deltas and estuaries by reducing the water flow. Second one is the flood control levees and dikes built along rivers alter and destroy aquatic habitats, disconnect rivers from their floodplains and eliminate wetlands and backwaters that are important spawning grounds for fish. And lastly, the inland wetlands have been drained or filled to grow crops. How sustainable are aquatic ecosystems? Bad news in terms of human impacts is that each stream, river, and lake reflects the sum of all that occurs in their watersheds. Also, many of the nutrients, wastes, and pollutants produced by human activities end up in the ocean. The good news is that aquatic life zones are constantly renewed because water is purified by natural hydrologic process. Nutrients cycle in and out, and populations of biological organisms can be replenished given sufficient opportunity and time.